Chapter 1. Introduction. Who was Margaret Thatcher? When you hear the name Margaret Thatcher, many people immediately think of one of the best-known but also most controversial politicians of the 20th century. She was the first woman to hold the office of British Prime Minister, and she shaped her country's politics for over a decade, from 1979 to 1990. But Thatcher was much more than just a head of government. She became a symbol of a certain kind of politics, of toughness, determination, and a conviction that earned her the nickname Iron Lady. Her reign was marked by far-reaching changes. It relied on economic liberalization, privatizations, and the reduction of the power of trade unions. She firmly believed in the power of the free market, discipline, and personal responsibility. For many Britons, she was the savior of a country that was reeling from crisis to crisis in the 1970s. For others, however, it was the one that exacerbated social divisions and made the life of the working class harder. But Margaret Thatcher was not only a national figure, but also an international one. She stood side by side with US President Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, maintained a tense relationship with Europe, and played a significant role in the transition to the world after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Today, her name stands for Thatcherism, a mixture of economic liberalism, conservatism, and an unshakable belief in her own mission. She polarized like hardly any other politician of her time, for some a heroine, for others an enemy. As we look at her life in the coming chapters, we will see the many facets of this extraordinary woman, from her humble beginnings in a small town in central England, to her steep political rise, to the triumphs and tragedies of her time at the top. It is the story of a woman who shaped an era with iron determination, and which continues to have an impact today.
Chapter 2. Childhood in Grantham, Shaped by Family and Values. Margaret Thatcher, née Roberts, was born on October 13, 1925, in the small town of Grantham in the county of Lincolnshire. Her childhood did not take place in the circles of the political elite, but in a simple but orderly and disciplined environment. The family owned a small grocery store, where Margaret helped out early on, an experience that would leave a mark on her life. Her father, Alfred Roberts, was the most formative role model. He was not only a shopkeeper, but also a committed local politician, Methodist preacher, and staunch conservative. From him, Margaret learned the values that she would later emphasize again and again in her political career: hard work, thrift, self-discipline, and the importance of individual responsibility. For Alfred Roberts, life was a matter of duty and morality, and it was precisely this view that he conveyed to his daughter. Her mother, Beatrice Roberts, ran the household and supported the family with quiet discipline. Margaret grew up in a strictly ordered environment in which diligence, order, and respect were integral parts of everyday life. Leisure and luxury were scarce. People lived frugally and frugally. Margaret's ambition became apparent early on. At school, she was considered hardworking, ambitious, and determined. She was interested in the natural sciences, but also in politics and debates. Her teachers noticed her extraordinary ability to formulate arguments clearly and logically. The religious character of her parents' home also played a central role. The Methodist tradition placed great emphasis on personal responsibility, moral rigor, and the idea that every person can shape his or her own life through hard work and faith. These values were to accompany Margaret throughout her life and later find their clearest expression in her political credo, "There is no such thing as society." In Grantham, she also learned what it means to be outside the social elite. She was not a child of a rich family, not a member of the upper class. Her origins were humble, and perhaps it was precisely this circumstance that fueled her irrepressible will to assert herself in a world dominated by men and traditions. So her childhood in Grantham was more than just a period of her life. It was the school of her character. It was here that the foundation was laid for the woman who would later steer the fate of Great Britain as Prime Minister.
Chapter 3. School Years and Oxford, The Path to Politics. After her childhood in Grantham, Margaret's path took her beyond school, to places that were by no means self-evident to a girl of her origin. At Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, she showed not only exceptional performances, but also remarkable ambition. While many of her classmates expected a more traditional way of life,
Margaret saw more. She wanted to study, prove herself, achieve something. Her interest in natural sciences was awakened at an early age. She was fascinated by chemistry, and so she successfully applied to the University of Oxford, more precisely to Somerville College, one of the few colleges that accepted women at the time. The move to Oxford was a huge leap for Margaret, from the tranquil world of Grantham to an academic elite marked by tradition, intellectuality, and social prestige. Oxford, more than just chemistry. At Oxford, Margaret Roberts studied chemistry and specialized in crystallography. But her true passion was not only the natural sciences, but politics. She joined the Oxford University Conservative Association, where she quickly became an active voice. Even there, her ability to argue clearly and determinedly, to represent her positions with persuasiveness, and to stand up to resistance was already evident. In 1946, she was even elected president of the Conservative Student Union, a remarkable success for a young woman at a time when politics was still strongly dominated by men. First, political influences. The post-war period had changed the face of Britain. The country was exhausted by the war, the economy was on the ground, and the Labour government under Clement Attlee relied on far-reaching reforms: the expansion of the welfare state, the nationalization of important industries, the establishment of the National Health Service, the NHS. For Margaret Roberts, these developments were formative, not because she supported them, but because she was critical of them. Early on, she developed her skepticism about state control and a conviction that individual freedom and personal responsibility were more important than collective solutions. Women in politics. At a time when women were still rare in politics, Margaret Roberts stood for a new generation. Her intellectual strength, her diligence, and her self-confident appearance made her stand out. She showed early on that she would not let conventions stop her, whether as a woman in a man's world or as a chemist aspiring to politics. Conclusion and first steps. In 1947, she completed her studies with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and initially began working as a research chemist. But her real passion remained politics. While still in Oxford, she had made the decision to actively apply for a seat in Parliament, a courageous step for a young woman without an aristocratic background. Oxford was thus not only an academic station for Margaret Thatcher, but the place where her political self-image was formed. It was here that her path into the world of great debate, convictions, and power began, a path that would soon lead her to the heart of British politics. Chapter 4. The First Steps, from Candidate to Member of Parliament. After graduating from Oxford, Margaret Roberts, like many of her fellow students, initially began a professional career, but it was clear to her that this would only be an intermediate step. Her real passion had long been politics. She didn't just want to have a say, she wanted to shape it. And so she began to be actively involved as a candidate of the Conservative Party. The first candidacy. As early as 1950, when she was barely 24 years old, she stood for the general election in the Dartford constituency. It was a hopeless constituency for the Conservatives, a stronghold of the Labour Party. But for Margaret, it was the perfect opportunity to make a name for herself. There, she immediately attracted attention. Young, ambitious, eloquent, and a woman, which was still a rarity in the political scene of the time. Her performances impressed not only local voters, but also the party leadership, which saw in her an emerging talent. Although she lost the election, her candidacy was an important step. It showed that Margaret Roberts had the courage and energy to stand her ground even in difficult situations. Profession and politics. Parallel to her political work, she initially remained active in her profession. She worked as a chemist before deciding to study law and work as a tax lawyer. This was no coincidence either. Tax issues were not only a legal specialty for her, but also a political issue close to her heart. Even then, she was convinced that high taxes undermined innovation and individual responsibility. Marriage and new name. In 1951, she married Dennis Thatcher, a successful businessman who was to be a stable support for her throughout her life. Dennis not only brought financial security to the marriage, but also supported Margaret in her political ambitions.
When she married, she took on the name by which she would later become world famous, Margaret Thatcher. In 1953, the twins Carol and Mark were born. Despite her family and children, Margaret stuck to her political goal, a balancing act that was unusual at the time. The way to Parliament. It took almost a decade before she finally made the leap into Parliament. In 1959, Margaret Thatcher was elected to the House of Commons in the Finchley constituency of North London. She had prevailed against male rivals and proved that she was not only ambitious, but also assertive. This entry into Parliament marked the beginning of the real political career of the woman who would later become world famous as the Iron Lady. She was now part of the political establishment, and yet at the same time, an outsider who went her own way.
Chapter 5. The Conservative Party in the 1950s and 1960s. When Margaret Thatcher entered the British Parliament in 1959, the Conservative Party was in a phase of stability but also of internal contradictions. After the Second World War, the Conservatives had taken over the government several times and had to come to terms with the new reality of an expanded welfare state. The Labour government under Clement Attlee had previously laid the foundation for a new social model with radical reforms: the nationalization of key industries, the establishment of the National Health Service, and a broad expansion of welfare state safeguards. The Conservatives, traditionally advocates of economic freedom and low taxes, accepted much of these changes in order not to lose their political connectivity. In the 1950s, the Conservatives ruled under Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and finally Alec Douglas Home. It was a time marked by economic boom and growing prosperity. Britain experienced the so-called affluent society, a society of increasing consumption and rising living standards. The party relied on a moderate program. It promised economic stability, but at the same time accepted the cornerstones of the welfare state. But behind this facade of stability, tensions are brewing. The Conservatives were in a constant balancing act between tradition and modernity, between their claim to economic freedom and the reality that large parts of the population no longer wanted to do without the social achievements of the post-war period. Margaret Thatcher watched these developments closely. She realized early on that the party could win elections, but was in danger of losing its ideological profile. For them, these years were an important learning phase. In the House of Commons, she began to get involved in committees and occupy topics that matched her profile: economy, finance, and education. She quickly made a name for herself as a competent and hardworking member of Parliament who familiarized herself deeply with complex issues. At the same time, she had to experience that women in politics continue to be viewed with skepticism. She was one of only a few female members of Parliament and stood out for that alone. The 1960s brought new challenges for the party. After years of prosperity, the economy began to weaken. Strikes, inflation, and increasing criticism of Britain's laggard status compared to more dynamic economies such as West Germany or France led to a political debate about the right course. While Labour responded with socialist ideas and an increased expansion of the state, the Conservatives often remained undecided. For Margaret Thatcher, this was a signal. During this time, she developed her conviction that the country could only be saved by a return to strict fiscal discipline, a weakening of the trade unions, and a clear commitment to the market economy. She saw how the party repeatedly made compromises that, in her eyes, led to weakness in the long term. These convictions would later form the core of Thatcherism. At the same time, she took her first steps in government offices in the 1960s. Under Prime Minister Edward Heath, who took over the government in 1970, she was appointed Minister of Education. This marked the beginning of a new phase in her career, in which she took on responsibility at the national level for the first time and was able to put her political ideas into practice. But before that happened, she had found an important place in the party in the 1950s and 60s. As a representative of a younger, ambitious generation that wanted to renew conservatism and that was not afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. Chapter 6. Advancement in the Shadows, Junior Minister and Minister of Education. When she entered Parliament in 1959, Margaret Thatcher was initially one young MP among many.
But it quickly became clear that she would not be satisfied with a supporting role. She worked tirelessly, spoke frequently in the House of Commons, and sought out topics that were technically demanding on the one hand and attracted attention on the other. It was clear early on that she had the ambition to one day be more than just a backbencher. The 1960s were a time of development for her, but also of learning. Under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and later Alec Douglas Home, she remained in the background, but she took every opportunity to familiarize herself with economic and financial policy issues. Her expertise in tax law stood her in good stead, and she developed a reputation for not shying away from detailed work. While other MPs focused on popular issues, she deliberately chose difficult policy areas that demonstrated her expertise and analytical strength. A decisive step came with the election of Edward Heath as party leader in 1965, when Heath wanted to modernize the Conservative Party and at the same time promote new talent. Thatcher caught his eye: young, competent, ambitious. When the Conservatives won the 1970 election, Heath brought her into his government and made her Minister of Education. This office was a challenge from the beginning. Britain's education system was changing. The question of how to increase equal opportunities and at the same time ensure the quality of education was passionately discussed. Thatcher, herself a woman who had achieved her rise through diligence and discipline, advocated strict standards and a rational, economically justifiable education policy. Her tenure as Minister of Education quickly earned her the nickname Milk Snatcher. The background was her decision to abolish free school milk for older primary school children. For them, this was a necessary cost-cutting measure, but for many parents and critics, it was a symbol of coldness and lack of care. This nickname accompanied her for years, and it shows how early she was perceived by the public as a tough and uncompromising politician. But even if it earned her criticism, Thatcher was able to sharpen her profile. She showed that she was willing to make unpopular decisions if she was convinced that they were necessary. It was precisely this characteristic that would later become her trademark. At the same time, she used her office to consolidate her basic political convictions. She believed that education should not be an instrument to enforce ideologies, but that it must be based on performance and responsibility. Government spending should be limited. Efficiency and discipline should be promoted. Her years as Minister of Education were thus not only an episode on her way to the top, but an important touchstone. She learned to deal with public criticism and proved that she remained steadfast even in heated debates. While many saw her decision to supply milk as a political own goal, Thatcher cemented her reputation as a politician who did not back down when she came under pressure. By the time the Conservative Party lost power in 1974, Thatcher had already been more than just a minister. She had shown herself to be a woman with backbone who could hold her own in the harsh climate of British politics. And it was precisely this image that would soon help her reach the next big stage of her career, rising to the top of the party. Chapter 7: The Milk Snatcher: Education Policy and Controversies. Margaret Thatcher's time as Minister of Education from 1970 to 1974 was a phase that shaped her more than she herself might have suspected. On the one hand, the office offered her the opportunity to gain her first government experience and to sharpen her profile as a determined politician. On the other hand, it taught her an early, bitter lesson in public perception and a nickname she never quite got rid of: Milk Snatcher. The background was a seemingly small measure, but it developed enormous symbolic power. In order to relieve the state budget, Thatcher decided to abolish free school milk for children over the age of 7. In their eyes, it was a sober, necessary cost-cutting measure. The state, they were convinced, could not distribute unlimited benefits, and parents should be able to pay for milk for their children themselves. But the public saw it differently. Newspapers ran indignant headlines, parents protested, and the opposition took up the decision with relish. A woman, of all people, who was a mother herself, deprived the children of a piece of free basic care. That was an affront to many. From then on, the nickname Milk Snatcher stuck with her and became a symbol of a policy that was perceived as hard, cold, and merciless. Thatcher herself reacted to this criticism with a mixture of defiance and conviction. She was sure that in the long term, only discipline and thrift could keep a country stable. For her, it was an example of how much populist outrage and sober necessity could diverge. It was also a foretaste of the kind of politics she would later do as Prime Minister, decisions not based on popularity but on conviction. In addition to the milk issue, she dealt with the restructuring of the British school system. During this time, the debate was held about the end of traditional grammar schools and the introduction of more comprehensive schools. Thatcher, who herself was convinced of performance-oriented education, was critical of these reforms, but as a minister, she had to bow to the majorities and political realities. Here, too, an area of tension was already evident that accompanied her entire career, the conflict between pragmatic action in office and ideological conviction. The years as Minister of Education thus put Thatcher in a double role. On the one hand, she was considered an up-and-coming talent within the Conservative Party, a woman who demonstrated intelligence, energy, and courage. On the other hand, she had already become the target of public criticism due to the milk snatcher controversy. For many voters, she symbolized a toughness that would later make her famous worldwide as the Iron Lady. When the Heath government lost power in 1974, Thatcher's career seemed at first glance to be in jeopardy. But in truth, it had gained profile precisely because of the controversies. She had shown that she could follow through with decisions, even if they were unpopular. She had proven that she could withstand the pressure. And that was exactly what would help her in the coming years when she took the most courageous step of her career, reaching for the party leadership.
Chapter 8. The Crisis of the 1970s. Inflation, Strikes, and Oil Crises. The 1970s were a time of uncertainty, economic turmoil, and political instability for Britain. For Margaret Thatcher, who experienced her decisive rise within the Conservative Party in this decade, these crises were also a breeding ground. They shaped her political thinking, provided her with the arguments for her reform programs, and gave her the stage on which she could show her determination. The decade began with economic problems that lingered from the 1960s. Declining productivity, a growing trade deficit, and inflation that increasingly burdened citizens' lives. But soon, even deeper upheavals occurred. In 1973, the oil crisis, triggered by the decision of the OPEC countries to cut oil production, led to a sharp rise in energy prices. Great Britain, heavily dependent on imports, fell into a state of shock. Companies had to cut production times, power shutdowns became a reality, and public life was noticeably affected. At the same time, the trade unions gained ever greater power. They were firmly anchored in many industries, and their ability to paralyze the country through strikes grew immeasurably. In 1974, there was a miners' strike that put Prime Minister Edward Heath on the defensive. Heath famously asked, "Who governs Britain?" and called for a general election. The answer of the voters was clear: not him. The Labour Party won, and Heath had to resign. For Margaret Thatcher, this was a key moment. She had experienced the weakness of her own party, which under Heath vacillated between pragmatism and indecision. At the same time, she saw how the country suffered under the power of the trade unions. It was clear to them that a conservative policy of the future could no longer be half-hearted. It had to be consistent, uncompromising, and clearly bound by principles. The crisis of the 1970s continued to worsen. Under the Labour governments of Harold Wilson and James Callaghan, attempts at reform were made, but the economic situation remained miserable. Inflation, unemployment, and stagnating growth determined everyday life. The so-called Winter of Discontent in 1978-1979 was particularly dramatic, when a wave of strikes paralyzed public life. Garbage collected in the streets, hospitals were overloaded, even cemetery workers went on strike. For many Britons, this winter symbolized the low point of a system that no longer worked. It was in this atmosphere that Thatcher began to evolve from an ambitious politician to a potential leader. She spoke openly about the need to break the power of the trade unions, to slim down the state, and to give space to market forces again. Their rhetoric was clearer, tougher, and more uncompromising than that of their conservative colleagues, who often still clung to the old consensus. The 1970s were thus not only a time of crisis for Britain, but also the turning point for Margaret Thatcher. She realized that the old policy of compromise had failed. In a country that longed for leadership, she offered exactly that: clear answers, iron principles, and the will to govern even in the face of resistance.
Chapter 9: The Road to Party Leadership, The Fall of Edward Heath. After the defeats of the Conservatives in the mid-1970s, the party seemed disoriented. Edward Heath, the party leader, was badly battered. His tenure as Prime Minister had been marked by crises: oil crisis, miners' strike, economic weakness, and his strategy of negotiating with the unions and relying on compromise had proven to be a failure. Many party members doubted his ability to lead the Conservatives back to power. In this atmosphere, Margaret Thatcher dared to take a step that hardly anyone would have thought possible. She stood against Heath in the 1975 election for party leadership. She, a woman from a humble background, not part of the party's aristocratic elite, wanted to challenge the powerful party leader. For many, this was presumptuous; for others, a fresh sign of courage. Their campaign was cleverly conducted. While Heath suffered from his battered image, Thatcher spoke a language that appealed to many party members: clear, principled, and full of determination. She promised to renew the Conservative Party, push back socialism, and give people responsibility for their own lives again. Their rhetoric differed from the cautious language of the party elite. She spoke of freedom and personal responsibility, words that sounded to many conservatives like a return to the roots. When the vote came, the party experienced a sensation. Thatcher won the first round by a clear margin and forced Heath to withdraw. In the second round, she finally prevailed and was elected leader of the Conservative Party, the first woman ever to lead one of the major parties in Great Britain. Their victory was more than just a change in leadership. It was a break with the old order. The Conservative Party had long been shaped by upper-class men who knew each other through networks, private schools, and universities. Thatcher, the daughter of a grocer from Grantham, did not fit into this picture. Her rise showed that even in a party full of tradition and hierarchies, there could be room for an outsider, as long as she was determined enough to assert herself. But her election also brought resistance. Many in the party considered her too inexperienced, too rigid in her views, too little consensus-oriented. Some simply smiled at her because she was a woman. But Thatcher didn't care. She knew that she could only stay at the top through steadfastness and clear principles. From 1975 onwards, she began to ideologically realign the Conservative Party. It opposed the politics of consensus that had characterized both Labour and the Tories since the war. She made it clear that the state must withdraw, that the market must be strengthened, and that the trade unions must lose their excessive power. These positions were controversial, even radical at the time, but they gave the party a new profile. The fall of Heath and Thatcher's rise to the party leadership marked the beginning of a new era. The ambitious minister had become a political leader who was determined to push through her ideas, and who would soon have the opportunity to implement her ideas in government. Chapter 10: The 1979 Election. Thatcher becomes Prime Minister. When Margaret Thatcher took over the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1975, it was not clear to many observers whether she would ever make the leap to the office of Prime Minister. Her opponents mocked her harsh voice, her uncompromising rhetoric, and her lack of experience in the highest government offices. But while others underestimated her, Thatcher worked tirelessly to get the Conservative Party on track and present herself as a credible alternative to the ruling Labour politicians. The second half of the 1970s was a time of increasing crisis for Britain. Under Prime Minister James Callaghan of the Labour Party, the country experienced rising inflation, economic stagnation, and growing unemployment. The trade unions, which had long had enormous power, blocked reforms and paralyzed the country with ever new waves of strikes. The notorious Winter of Discontent of 1978-99, in which mountains of garbage lay on the streets, hospitals worked only to a limited extent, and even gravediggers went on strike, became a symbol of decline for many Britons. Thatcher knew how to pick up on this discontent. She spoke of the need to free the country from the clutches of the trade unions, of a return to order, discipline, and personal responsibility.
Her speeches were clear, direct, and delivered with a moral conviction that seemed like a liberating blow to many Britons. Where other politicians hesitated, Thatcher seemed determined. In the 1979 election campaign, she relied heavily on issues such as the economy, taxes, and internal security. With slogans such as "Labor isn't working," which alluded to rising unemployment, the Conservatives managed to pick up on the mood in the country. Thatcher presented herself as a strong woman who was willing to make tough decisions to get Britain back on its feet. The election in May 1979 finally brought the breakthrough. The Conservatives won a clear victory, and Margaret Thatcher became the first woman in British history to become Prime Minister. Her entry into Downing Street was a historic moment. In front of the famous Black Door of Number 10, she spoke a Bible quotation that aptly summed up her attitude. "Where there is disunity, let us bring unity. Where there is doubt, let us bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope." But behind the solemn words, she knew that a difficult path lay ahead of her. The country was economically exhausted, society was deeply divided, and expectations were high. For Thatcher, the election victory was not the goal, but the beginning of her toughest task, to reform Britain, even against the resistance of those who rejected her methods. May 1979 marked the beginning of the Thatcher era. It was to change not only Britain, but also the political landscape of Europe and the world.
Chapter 11. The Early Years: Reforms, Resistance, and Economic Hardship. When Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, she inherited a country that was deep in crisis. Britain was considered the sick man of Europe. Inflation was high, productivity was low, trade unions were blocking reforms, and confidence in the country's future seemed to be exhausted. It was clear to many Britons that a fundamental change was necessary, but the harshness with which Thatcher pushed through this change surprised even her supporters. From the outset, she made it clear that she was not willing to continue down the path of political consensus that her predecessors had taken. Instead, it relied on an uncompromising economic line: fighting inflation, reducing government spending, breaking the power of the trade unions, and aligning the economy with market mechanisms. Her government was guided by the ideas of monetarism, as advocated by economists such as Milton Friedman. The first measures hit people hard. Subsidies for ailing industries have been cut, government intervention has been scaled back, taxes have been restructured. For Thatcher, this was necessary to break the vicious circle of inflation and economic stagnation. For many workers, however, it meant job losses, insecurity, and social hardship. Unemployment rose dramatically in the first years of her term in office, reaching record levels of over 3 million people in the early 1980s. Entire regions dependent on heavy industry and mining suffered from factory closures and mass layoffs. Critics accused Thatcher of destroying the country's social substance. Demonstrations and protests increased, and her popularity plummeted. But Thatcher did not back down. She was convinced that only through this toughness was real change possible. For them, short-term hardship was the price for long-term renewal. "You can't spend your way out of a recession," she used to say. "You can't buy your way out of a recession. Instead, one must persevere, reduce costs, and give room to market forces." Her government also began a program of privatizations that would later become a hallmark of her policies. Although this project started cautiously in the first few years, companies that had long been in state hands were soon sold, a signal of the country's new course. The first few years were therefore a test. For many, it seemed as if their policies were dividing the country, as if they were hitting the poor harder and distributing wealth unequally. Her opponents, inside and outside Parliament, spoke of cruelty and intransigence. But Thatcher remained steadfast. She saw herself as a captain steering her ship through a storm, knowing that turning back would only lead to doom. When she came under increasing pressure in the early 1980s, her political career already seemed to be in danger. Many wondered whether she would even survive the next election. But then came an event that not only saved her position, but finally made her a historical figure: the Falklands War. Chapter 12. The Falklands War in 1982: Victory and Resurgence. In the spring of 1982, Margaret Thatcher found herself in a difficult domestic political situation.
Unemployment had reached record highs, its reforms were met with resistance, and its popularity was at an all-time low. Many observers thought it possible that she would lose the next election. But then a conflict broke out that would change the direction of her entire career: the Falklands War. The Falkland Islands, a remote British overseas territory in the South Atlantic with only a few thousand inhabitants, had been at the center of a territorial dispute with Argentina for decades. For most Britons, they hardly played a role in everyday life. But for the Argentine military junta under General Leopoldo Galtieri, they offered the opportunity to distract from domestic political problems and invoke national unity. On April 2, 1982, Argentine troops landed on the islands and occupied them. The news came as a shock to London. For many in the political class, it was inconceivable that Britain, once a world power, could simply accept such humiliation. But there were also voices urging caution. The Falklands were almost 13,000 kilometers away, and a military reconquest seemed risky and expensive. Some advised Thatcher to accept the occupation and negotiate. But that was out of the question for her. Thatcher saw the Argentine invasion not only as an attack on a piece of British territory, but also on national self-confidence. She knew that if Britain appeared weak now, it would no longer be taken seriously internationally. With iron determination, it decided to send a task force to the South Atlantic to recapture the islands. The following weeks turned into a dramatic military operation. Aircraft carriers, warships, submarines, and thousands of soldiers were set in motion. The fighting was fierce and caused losses. Ships such as HMS Sheffield were sunk. British and Argentine soldiers lost their lives. But step by step, the British troops managed to gain the upper hand. On June 14, 1982, the Argentine forces surrendered in the Falklands. Britain had won a clear military victory, and Margaret Thatcher had proven herself to be a determined war leader. The success changed her image abruptly. A prime minister who was considered by many to be insecure and unpopular became the Iron Lady, the Iron Woman who was ready to fight for her country. Her political fate had changed completely within a few months. In the 1983 general election, the Conservatives won an overwhelming victory based on the patriotic momentum of the Falklands War. The conflict had not only saved her political position, but also strengthened her self-confidence. From now on, Thatcher saw herself confirmed in her style: toughness, determination, and the refusal to compromise when it came to questions of principle. For Britain, the Falklands War was a moment of national rebirth. For Margaret Thatcher, it was the decisive turning point, the moment when she finally became the Iron Lady.
Chapter 13. The Second Term: Privatizations and Deregulation. After the overwhelming election victory of 1983, Margaret Thatcher was at the height of her power. The triumph in the Falklands War had given her the aura of a strong and unwavering leader, and the clear majority in the House of Commons gave her the political freedom of action she needed for her ambitious reforms. Now, she wanted to implement her economic policy program in all consistency, a program that was to change the face of Britain forever. The focus of her second term in office was the privatization of state-owned companies. Since the 1940s, Britain has had a variety of key industries in public hands: energy, steel, telecommunications, waterworks, and much more. Thatcher was convinced that state control was inefficient and inhibited innovation. She firmly believed that only free market competition could bring growth and prosperity. Under her government, numerous companies were privatized in the 1980s, including British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, the steel industry, and many more. Millions of citizens were encouraged to buy shares, and in fact, the number of shareholders in the UK increased significantly. For many people, this was their first direct participation in the capital market, and a visible sign of the new economic zeitgeist. At the same time, her government relied on deregulation, especially in the financial sector. The aim was to make London one of the world's leading financial centers again. This policy culminated in 1986 in the so-called Big Bang, a radical liberalization of the London Stock Exchange, which modernized the financial market and attracted international investors. London became a global financial center in the decades that followed, but at the same time, Thatcher laid the foundation for growing social inequalities. The second term also brought major changes in the social fabric of the country. The housing market was liberalized, and the Right to Buy program gave millions of tenants of social housing the opportunity to buy their apartments. For many families, this was a step towards ownership and prosperity, but critics warned that it would permanently shrink the stock of affordable housing. Thatcher's policies were deeply controversial. On the one hand, her supporters rejoiced. They saw her as the woman who freed Britain from its lethargy, turned people into owners, and put the economy back on track for growth. On the other hand, there was growing criticism that her reforms were deepening the social divide in the country. Entire industries, especially in the north of England and Scotland, collapsed. Unemployment and poverty rose in these regions, while the south, especially London, boomed. But Thatcher remained steadfast. She did not see the resistance as a warning signal, but as confirmation that she was on the right track. For them, politics was not a popularity contest, but a struggle for principles. "The lady's not for turning" was one of her most famous sentences, which perfectly summed up her attitude. Her second term in office was thus a phase of profound transformation. The old post-war Britain, with its nationalized industries, strong trade unions, and state control, disappeared step by step. It was replaced by a new, liberalized Great Britain that relied on the market, competition, and individual responsibility.
Chapter 14. Thatcher and Europe. Friendship and skepticism at the same time. Margaret Thatcher's relationship with Europe was ambivalent from the outside, marked by pragmatism but also by deep mistrust. On the one hand, she recognized the importance of the European market for the British economy. On the other hand, she was reluctant to think that Britain should cede national sovereignty to supranational institutions. In the early 1980s, the European Community, which later became the European Union, was in the process of becoming more closely interconnected. The focus was on issues such as joint financing, agricultural policy, and the internal market. For Thatcher, this was a double-edged sword. She wanted Britain to benefit from the economic benefits, while at the same time, she wanted to prevent Brussels from gaining too much power over British politics. Her stance became particularly clear in the notorious budget negotiations. Britain paid more into the EU budget than it got back, mainly because of the common agricultural policy, from which France, which was more agriculturally strong, benefited massively. Thatcher saw this as unfair and fought for years to find a balance. Her famous sentence, "I want my money back," became the watchword of her European policy. In 1984, she finally achieved the so-called British rebate, which significantly reduced British contributions, a diplomatic success that earned her great applause at home, but increased mistrust and rejection in Europe. But as harsh as her stance was, she was not fundamentally against Europe. It supported the idea of a common internal market because it corresponded to the principles it also pursued in its own country: competition, deregulation, open markets. In this regard, it worked closely with European partners. At the same time, however, it resolutely opposed any development that went in the direction of a political union or a common currency. For Thatcher, Britain was a proud nation that should keep its own currency, its own laws, and its own foreign policy. Her skepticism about European integration led to increasing tensions, not only with other European leaders, but also within her own party. While some conservatives supported Thatcher's hard line, others saw the danger of Britain being isolated. This internal conflict was to grow in the coming years and eventually play a decisive role in their political decline. Europe was thus a touchstone of Thatcher's political character. She showed her ability to negotiate hard and stand up for British interests. At the same time, her attitude revealed a deep skepticism about any form of supranational power, which she saw as a threat to national sovereignty. Her legacy in European politics is still noticeable today. Many of the arguments that played a role decades later in the Brexit referendum can already be found in Thatcher's speeches and decisions. For her supporters, she was the woman who earned Britain respect in Europe. For her critics, she was the politician who alienated the country from the European project. Either way, her role in the history of European integration remains a central chapter of her political life to this day. Chapter 15. The Miners' Strike 1984/85. Struggle for Power and Trade Unions. If there is one event that makes the political style and personality of Margaret Thatcher visible as if under a magnifying glass, it is the Great Miners' Strike of 1984-85. This conflict was more than a labor dispute. It was a political showdown, a power struggle between a government that wanted to fundamentally change the country and a trade union movement that had been one of the most powerful forces in Britain for decades. The British coal industry had long been an economic problem child in the 1980s. Many mines were outdated, unprofitable, and only kept alive by government subsidies. For Thatcher, who wanted to give more space to market forces, it was clear that the country could no longer afford such permanent support. The National Coal Board therefore announced the closure of numerous mines, a decision that threatened tens of thousands of jobs and hit entire regions to the core. The response of the trade unions was not long in coming. Under the leadership of Arthur Scargill, the charismatic leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, the miners went on strike that would last for almost a year. For Scargill, this was not only a struggle for jobs, but also a struggle for political power. He saw the Thatcher government as an enemy of the working class and was convinced that a determined strike would bring the government to its knees. But Thatcher was determined to prove exactly the opposite. It saw the trade unions, especially the NUM, as a threat to democracy because they determined the country's politics with their blocking power. Even before the strike began, her government had taken measures to be prepared for this moment. Coal stocks were stockpiled, the police were organized and ready to meet the strike with all severity. The strike developed into an open confrontation. In mining regions such as Yorkshire, South Wales, and Scotland, there were massive clashes between strikers and police. Images of street battles, burning barricades, and arrested miners went around the world. The Battle of Orgreave became particularly notorious, in which there were heavy clashes between thousands of strikers and police officers. Society was divided. Many working-class families suffered from poverty because wages no longer flowed. Solidarity movements collected money and food to support the strikers. At the same time, however, there was also growing public criticism of the harshness of the trade unions, which paralyzed the everyday lives of many people. Thatcher remained unyielding. For them, this was a fight to the death, not only for coal mines, but for the political future of the country. She refused to give in, even as the social costs of the strike became increasingly apparent. Her stance was uncompromising, and she made it clear. We had to fight the enemy without in the Falklands. We always have to be aware of the enemy within. We had to fight the enemy out in the Falklands, and we must also be aware of the enemy within. After almost a year, the strike ended in March 1985, without the miners having achieved their goals. They returned to the mines weakened, and many of them lost their jobs soon after, when the announced closures were implemented. For Thatcher, this was a decisive victory. She had broken the power of the trade unions and proved that her government was not susceptible to blackmail. But the price was high. Entire communities in the mining regions disintegrated. Unemployment and a lack of prospects shaped the lives of many families for generations. To this day, the miners' strike remains a symbol of Thatcher's time in government. For her determination, her will to push through reforms even in the face of massive resistance, but also for the harshness with which she fought social conflicts. For her supporters, she was the one who freed the country from the tyranny of the trade unions. For her opponents, she was the one who broke the backbone of the working class.
Chapter 16. The Iron Lady in the Cold War. Relationship with Reagan and Gorbachev. The nickname Iron Lady was originally given to Margaret Thatcher by the Soviet press, and it was by no means meant kindly. But Thatcher accepted the title. Yes, she wore it with pride. It suited her self-image, a woman who remained steadfast, showed toughness, and tolerated no weakness against the Soviet Union in the face of the Cold War. In the 1980s, world politics was dominated by the East-West conflict. The nuclear arms race, the stationing of new intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and the ongoing confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact dominated the headlines. Thatcher positioned herself clearly. Britain stood firmly by the side of the United States, and she strictly rejected any appeasement policy towards Moscow. Her close friendship with Ronald Reagan, who became President of the United States in 1981, played a central role in this. The two were connected not only by a political partnership, but also by a personal sympathy. They shared a belief in the free market, in the need to challenge communism, and in the importance of national strength. For many observers, they were the perfect duo of the Western world. He in Washington, she in London, together the face of a new conservative wave. But Thatcher's role in the Cold War was more complex than her image suggested. Although she showed toughness towards the Soviet Union, she recognized early on that change was on the horizon there. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s, she was one of the first Western heads of state to take his willingness to reform seriously. After a meeting with him, she declared, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business with him. This sentence marked a turning point. Thatcher remained adamant about the military strength of the West. She supported Reagan's deployment of new missiles in Europe and defended nuclear deterrence. But at the same time, it was prepared to promote Gorbachev's reform policy of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, transformation. It thus played an important role in the rapprochement between East and West, which ultimately led to the historic disarmament treaties and the end of the Cold War. Her stance during the Cold War was a reflection of her entire policy: toughness when it was necessary and pragmatism when opportunities presented themselves. She knew how to demonstrate strength without losing the possibility of dialogue. She was thus a key figure in the Western alliance. For the British, Thatcher's role in the Cold War strengthened national self-confidence. Many felt that Britain, although economically weakened, once again had a weighty voice on the world political stage, not least because its prime minister was one of the central players alongside Reagan and Gorbachev. Thus, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher became the Iron Lady not only in the British context, but also on a global scale. She was one of the last great voices of the Cold War, tough on the Soviet threat, but shrewd enough to see the signs of change.
Chapter 17: Social Policy and Divisions in the Country. As much as Margaret Thatcher shone on the international stage as a strong leader, her policies divided her own country deeply. Their economic reforms, their attitude towards trade unions, and their consistent enforcement of free market principles had led to growth and modernization, but they also created a society in which winners and losers were more clearly divided than ever before. At the heart of their social policy was the conviction that the state should not be responsible for all areas of life. She believed that personal responsibility, family, and market mechanisms were more important than state welfare. Her sentence became famous, or notorious: "There is no such thing as society." For her, this did not mean that there was no community, but that responsibility could not be delegated to an abstract society. Every individual, every family must stand up for their own lives. This thinking was reflected in many policy measures. With the Right to Buy program, millions of tenants of social housing were given the opportunity to buy their apartments. For many, this was a path to property acquisition and a piece of social advancement. At the same time, however, it reduced the stock of affordable housing, which exacerbated social problems in the long term. Thatcher also relied on austerity measures and reforms in the healthcare and education sectors. The National Health Service, NHS, remained untouched, but funding was more strictly controlled. In the education sector, it emphasized performance and competition, promoted standardized tests, and expanded the role of private schools. Critics saw this as a weakening of the idea of solidarity, while their supporters saw it as an urgently needed increase in quality. The effects of their policies were particularly strong in the traditional industrial areas of northern England, Wales, and Scotland. There, mine closures, factory closures, and the abandonment of subsidized industries led to mass unemployment and social upheaval. Entire communities that had lived from mining or the steel industry for generations lost their economic basis. While London and southern England benefited from the rise of the financial sector and the service economy, the regions in the north suffered from a deep structural change that seemed like a decline to many. These divisions shaped the social climate in the 1980s. For some, Thatcher was the savior who modernized Britain and made it strong again internationally. For others, she was the politician who destroyed solidarity, increased inequality, and drove the country apart. Thatcher herself did not perceive this criticism as a weakness. She believed that real change was only possible through hardship and sacrifice. "You turn if you want to, the lady's not for turning," she once said. For them, politics meant enforcing principles, even if they were unpopular. But the social scars left by her policies remained. Decades later, people in the former mining regions still spoke of the Thatcher years as a time when their world was destroyed. At the same time, many families in the South saw the 1980s as an era of new opportunities, prosperity, and advancement. Thus, their social policy became the core of their internal British controversy. A program that on the one hand brought modernization, but on the other hand exacerbated the gap between rich and poor, between North and South, between winners and losers.
Chapter 18. The Third Term, Triumphs and Growing Resistance. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher won the general election for the third consecutive year, a triumph that cemented her position as one of the most powerful prime ministers in modern British history. Never before had a woman in Europe been at the head of a large country for so long. With this victory, it seemed as if their political project was irreversible. But while she continued to achieve successes in foreign policy and economics, resistance to her leadership style and reforms grew within her party and in the country itself. Thatcher's third term in office began with self-confidence. It had weakened the trade unions, liberalized the economy, and strengthened the financial sector. Britain was once again in the spotlight of world politics, and she herself was celebrated internationally as a symbol of strength and determination. Her collaboration with Ronald Reagan and her clear course in the Cold War had made her a global figure. But internally, it became apparent that the harshness with which she ruled was increasingly creating tensions. Her absolute conviction that she had the right answers made her unyielding to criticism, even from her own ranks. Where other politicians sought compromises, Thatcher remained steadfast. This style, which had made her strong, now led to more and more party colleagues feeling that they were being ignored. One of the biggest points of contention during this time was their attitude towards Europe. While part of her party advocated closer European integration, Thatcher increasingly opposed it. She distrusted any development that she believed endangered British sovereignty. Her famous Bruges speech of 1988 put this in a nutshell. In it, she warned against a European superstate and made it clear that Britain would remain in the European single market but would not accept a political union. This speech divided not only Europe but also her party. At the same time, she continued to push ahead with domestic reforms that mobilized her opponents. Particularly controversial was the introduction of the community charge, better known as the poll tax. This tax was intended to simplify the financing of municipalities, but was perceived as deeply antisocial, as it was levied on every adult at a flat rate, regardless of income. In many cities, there were massive protests and even riots, painting the picture of an increasingly alienated government. Despite these controversies, Thatcher remained outwardly unyielding. She stuck to her convictions and showed little willingness to react to the criticism. For her supporters, this was a sign of strength. For her opponents, it was proof of dangerous stubbornness. The third term in office was thus marked by a paradoxical picture. On the one hand, a prime minister who was historically successful and had profoundly changed the country. On the other hand, a growing number of critics within her own party and in society who felt repelled by her uncompromising style. At the end of this term in office, it became increasingly clear that as much as Thatcher had shaped the country according to her ideas, so much did the resistance to her person. Their biggest victory, the third election in a row, also marked the beginning of the end. Because the conflicts she fueled during these years were soon to cost her her power.
Chapter 19. The Case of the Prime Minister, Resignation in 1990. When Margaret Thatcher was elected for the third time in a row in 1987, she seemed untouchable. But only 3 years later, in November 1990, she was unexpectedly forced to resign, overthrown not by the opposition but by her own ranks. The case of the Iron Lady was a lesson in how quickly political power can break down when it moves away from the grassroots. The beginning of the end became apparent in the late 1980s. Her leadership style had become increasingly authoritarian. Where she had once appeared as a fresh voice with clear principles, many of her colleagues now saw a prime minister who ignored advice and reacted to criticism only with defiance. This attitude increased tensions in his own party, especially on the issue of Europe. The famous Bruges speech of 1988 had shown that Thatcher was firmly opposed to deeper European integration. She warned of a European superstate that threatens national sovereignty. Many conservatives agreed with her on substance, but others feared that she would isolate Britain. When the discussion about a closer economic and political union, the forerunner of the European Union, intensified in 1990, the dispute escalated. At the same time, the poll tax massively weighed on her popularity. This new poll tax, which every adult had to pay, regardless of income, was perceived as deeply unfair. Protests broke out in many cities, culminating in violent riots in 1990, such as the poll tax riots in London. For many Britons, this was proof that Thatcher's policies had lost their social balance. Resistance grew in his own party. Ministers resigned, MPs grumbled openly, and finally, an opposing candidate stood up. Michael Heseltine, one of her longtime rivals, challenged her in an internal party election. Thatcher won the first vote, but not with the required majority. This made it clear that their authority was shaken. In the days that followed, she tried to save her position. She declared resolutely that she wanted to continue fighting, but her closest confidants made it clear to her that she had lost the support of the party. On November 22, 1990, Margaret Thatcher finally resigned. After more than 11 years in office, she left Downing Street, tears in her eyes, but her head held high. Her resignation marked the end of an era. It had shaped Britain like hardly anyone before, changed the political landscape, and redefined conservatism. But her own party had turned against her, not because her policies had failed, but because her leadership style no longer allowed for compromise. For many, this moment was a shock. The Iron Lady, who never backed down, had been pushed aside by her own people. For others, it was a relief, the end of a period of government that they saw as dividing the country. Either way, his retirement in 1990 was the dramatic end to a career that had made history.
Chapter 20. Reverberations and Legacy. Thatcherism, Criticism, and Admiration. Margaret Thatcher's political career did not end abruptly with her resignation in 1990, but the Thatcher era as a formative force in British politics was over. She left behind a country that had fundamentally changed her, and a legacy that is still controversially discussed today. The term Thatcherism still stands for their ideology and way of governing. It includes a clear turn to free market principles, the weakening of state control, the privatization of large industries, and the emphasis on ownership over state welfare. For its supporters, Thatcherism was a liberation. Britain was led out of economic stagnation, inflation was lowered, and international competitiveness was strengthened. London became one of the world's leading financial centers, and millions of people were given new opportunities through privatization and property ownership programs. But for her critics, Thatcherism was synonymous with social division. They accused it of deepening the gap between rich and poor, neglecting the traditional industrial areas in the north, and destroying entire working communities. In cities such as Liverpool, Sheffield, or the Welsh mining regions, the memory of the 1980s remains marked by unemployment and hopelessness. For many people, Thatcher is still a symbolic figure of loss and hardship. Their relationship to Europe also continues to have an impact today. Their skepticism about Brussels and the demand for national sovereignty shaped the Conservative Party for decades to come. Some historians already see Thatcher's stance as the ideological basis for Brexit, which became a reality in 2016. Internationally, her legacy also remains ambivalent. On the one hand, she was one of the key figures of the late Cold War, standing side by side with Ronald Reagan and recognizing Mikhail Gorbachev's potential early on. Her role in the transition to a new world order after 1989 made her a global figure. On the other hand, their policies here were also marked by harshness. For example, in their uncompromising attitude towards South Africa during apartheid, or in their proximity to authoritarian regimes as long as they stood against communism. After her resignation, Thatcher remained a member of the House of Lords as Baroness Thatcher, and an important voice in political discourse. But her position within her own party remained difficult. Her successors, John Major and later David Cameron, had to deal with their legacy on the one hand and find their own ways to overcome the deep rifts it had left behind. When Margaret Thatcher died in 2013 at the age of 87, the country's reaction was divided, as it was throughout her career. For some, she was the greatest prime minister since Churchill, a woman who had renewed Britain and made it strong. For others, she remained a figure who embodied toughness and inequality. While solemn mourning ceremonies took place in London, some in the old mining regions celebrated their deaths as the end of a shadow that had hung over them. And yet, no one can deny that Margaret Thatcher made history. She was the first woman to lead the country. She shaped the politics of Europe and the world for over a decade, and she embodied an attitude that combined courage, determination, and principle. Their legacy remains contradictory, but that is precisely where its significance lies. Margaret Thatcher changed not only politics, but also the political culture of Britain. She was the Iron Lady, admired, feared, hated, revered. A woman who did not turn back when resistance came, and who has shaped the image of her country to this day like hardly any other prime minister.